Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. Welcome to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. Bienvenue au Musée canadien pour les droits de la personne. My name is Angela Cassie, and I'm the Senior Vice President of Programs, Exhibitions, and Public Affairs with the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and I'm pleased to be your MC for this evening. In addition to those joining us here in Winnipeg, we are pleased to welcome those watching us via live stream. Thank you to the Globe and Mail for their partnership on tonight's live stream. And we're here in Winnipeg. We're known for our warm welcome. So can we welcome everyone on the live stream, please? Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge that we at the museum are on ancestral lands, on Treaty 1 territory. These lands are also known as the heartland of the Métis people. I would also like to acknowledge that the water in the museum is sourced from Shoal Lake First Nation. Before we begin with our program, I'd also like to recognize the vigil that is happening here in Winnipeg tonight to remember the victims of Saturday's shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Other vigils have also taken place across the country. And I think standing here in a museum for human rights, we recognize the importance to speak out, to stand together. So I would like you all to join me now in a moment of silence, observed to recognize the loss of 11 lives. Thank you. We're very fortunate to work very closely with the next individual I would like to introduce. Elder Barbara Nepanak, in these doors, doesn't really need an introduction. A cultural awareness coordinator and a member of the Pine Creek Ojibwe First Nation. After retirement from a 35-year career in the federal public service, she serves on numerous boards and committees, including our museum's Standing Indigenous Advisory Committee. She has received numerous awards and accolades for her positive work around cultural awareness, and I would have to say her tireless work around cultural awareness, included but not limited to the Knowledge Keepers Award from the Circle of Educators and the Grandmothers Award for keeping the fires burning with Gani Ganichek. In 2012, Barbara and her husband, Clarence Nepanak, who's also an elder that serves on our advisory committee, received the Queen's Jubilee Award. I would like to now invite Elder Nepanak to the stage to begin with an opening blessing. Please join me in welcoming Barbara. And Clarence.
Can you put that mic down? Thank you. Thank you very much. We're always honored to come and bring greetings and to welcome visitors to our ancestral land, the land of my ancestors, the homeland of the Métis and the Inuit. It's always an honor to do this for people like yourselves, and most of all, our special guests here. As it is in our tradition, we have protocols, and I have been given tobacco, which is one of our sacred medicines that we use in order for us to say the prayer. And so also I'd also like to explain that in the tradition that I follow, which is an oral tradition, I was always to pray in the language you know best. My first language is Ojibwe. So to this day, I still practice that. I pray in my language. But also, not only do I pray, but I pray for people that are visiting, people that are sick, people that have addictions, people that are homeless, and people that have illnesses in their families. And I pray for our children, the future of our generations to come. I pray for strength and guidance, and I pray that one day we all stand together in harmony, and to be able to acknowledge each other's differences and to respect that. We all, have our own injustices in our societies, and that's my responsibility as an Anishinaabe, to pray to that. Because, we are life givers. We have to to nourish our souls and also our people, and also all people. So with that, my traditional name is Tutanaberdoma Nijobine Sikwe, and I'm Bear Clan. And that's normally how we start our prayers in our tradition. Nijobine Sikwe ndi umakwa dode. Migani na mawa se maga mishine na magwanche mega hikituan. Ambe we bite maga togoshin. Migwets de na iksketut ke na maje togoshin. Kchina da utaga chike to goek. Wabskiek. Ambe ge bitek. Kchina da oto chi mamu biang. Chika kanun diang. Chawaban da mangani neje. Esh matisiang. Ambe ge shemane tu esh bok send man. Shawena mishnam waban de shinam bemna matisiwen. Kitamagino shinam memetagon goeka akosiat. Misiega shikshunuat. Misiega hotagetuat and shinabek. Kitamagino gave you knowing gave you no web matisiuk. Kchina and Agotanish be matisiwen. Chamanaje tuang. And bekeget where kaina piangwe, Kaishiga hikituang, Kaishiga is among it keshamanitu. Chikashket tuang, chisongitang, chibabitamang, where Hataget tuang marking. Chanikashket tuang again and Shnabe young Janinigan young. Miani shiega, China and Ahok. Chamanachi eating, shawending. And bege, quick chichigan obanting. Menogum geshaman the way she book send among. Ni boy yega, she book send a man. Sanagata shani shama king jab musing. Me what the non geshaman the way she book send among. Me question to get no gagishga and to all my relations. Thank you. Me gwetch.
Thank you so much, Barbara and Clarence. So this is the third of our President's Lecture Series, and we're so pleased to have journalist, filmmaker, and vice chair of the Open Russia Movement, Vladimir Kara-Murza, with us here today. Our format for this evening will include a presentation by our speaker, followed by an in-conversation with the museum's president and CEO, Dr. John Young. And after that, we will have an opportunity for some questions, either here in the room or online. We'll also invite you throughout the conversation to submit your questions, and you can use the Twitter question, and even if you're here in the room, you can use the Twitter question with the hashtag #AskKaramurza. Or again, you can submit a question on your Facebook post for tonight's event. So multiple ways for you to be able to join the conversation. So I'd now like to introduce Dr. John Young. John lived and worked in Russia at different times over the span of 20 years, from 1988 to 2008. He witnessed the shift from Soviet rule to perestroika, to the return of many totalitarian practices under Vladimir Putin. As an academic, John specialized in post-Soviet Russian studies with a particular interest in democratic reform. In his role as president and CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, he remains very interested in how courageous citizens can nurture democracy in the face of dictatorship. Please join me now in welcoming to the stage Dr. John Young.
Bonsoir tout le monde. Thank you, Angela, and thank you, Barbara and Clarence. Welcome to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So glad that you could join us this evening for the third gathering of our President's Lecture Series this year. The purpose of this lecture series is to broaden the dialogue that is ongoing here every day at the museum about the importance of human rights in Canada and around the world. Throughout this series, we've spoken to individuals who live their lives on the front lines of some of the most important human rights struggles of our era. For Michael Petru, the award-winning journalist and author who opened our series in January, that struggle was for truth and honesty, exposing the enormous effort and resources dedicated by ISIS to a propaganda strategy seeding hatred against the Yazidi. For John Burroughs, our second lecturer, Anishinaabe from the Chippewas of the Nawa First Nation and professor of law at the University of Victoria, that struggle is for respect of Indigenous constitutional rights and Indigenous legal traditions. This evening we hear from the third lecturer in our series, a leading figure in the struggle for democracy and freedom of expression in Russia, Vladimir Kara-Murza. Vladimir began working as a journalist at the age of 16. Since then, he has published in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, World Affairs, and many more Russian print and broadcast outlets. He has served several different Russian organizations advocating for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Since 2014, he has been the vice chairman of the Open Russia movement, and the past 2 years, chairman of the Boris Nemtsov Foundation for Freedom. He has also directed 2 documentary films, 2005's They Chose Freedom on the dissident movement within the USSR, and 2016's Nemtsov on the life of Boris Nemtsov. He entered public life as a candidate for the Russian parliament in 2003, and since then has remained active in domestic and foreign politics. He was a driving force behind the 2012 Magnitsky Act that refuses entry to the United States and denies access to the U.S. banking system for Russian officials believed to have been involved with the suspicious death of Russian anti-corruption investigator Sergei Magnitsky. And he has also advocated for a similar law which came into force here in Canada just over a year ago, the Justice for Victims of Corrupt Foreign Officials Act, which allows our federal government to freeze assets held in Canada by those who have committed gross human rights violations. Vladimir has paid dearly for these efforts. His friend and fellow opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, was gunned down and died in the shadow of the Kremlin in 2015. 3 months later, Vladimir was poisoned, fell into a coma, took several months to recover, and in 2017 he was poisoned again. Talking about resilience, he continues to defend the idea that Russia is ready for a government that is not the kleptocracy of Vladimir Putin, despite the clear and present danger involved in being such a courageous advocate. His faith in the importance of dialogue about ideas and opinions in a society where citizens can decide for themselves what they believe remains unshaken. His story also serves as a reminder to all of us as Canadians that while we enjoy the right to gather at events like this, to listen to those who disagree with the powerful, to give an audience to the impassioned dissent without fear of violent retribution, not everyone is afforded that right. As Angela noted, I have spent a couple decades of my life studying and researching in Russia, and at various times living in that country. I saw the tail end of the Soviet era in the early days of perestroika, through the optimism and aspirations of the early 1990s, through the despair as things didn't turn out quite as people had hoped, and then lived through their first 2 terms of Putin's Russia. So from perestroika through democratizatia to the economic turmoil, through the thermidor of Putin, these have been heady times. Optimism, cynicism, hope, disappointment. Russia has been engaged in a long and wandering journey that in many ways is a continuation of a journey that started more than 100 years ago. So to help us better understand the fight for freedom in Russia today, please join me in welcoming Vladimir Kara-Murza.
Thank you very much, and I want to first of all thank the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and its President and CEO, Dr. John Young, and the wonderful team here at the museum for your Manitoban hospitality. It is my first time, not just at the museum, but in your wonderful province and your wonderful city, and I'm honored to be with you here this evening. And I want to say a special thank you for the choice of date for our conversation. I don't know if this was deliberate or just a remarkable coincidence, but today, October 30th, is marked in Russia as Political Prisoner Day, a day to support and remember all of those who have been deprived of their freedom for the only crime of standing up for what they believe in. The origins of this day go back to 1974, when political prisoners in the labor camps of Perm and Mordovia and the Vladimir city prison declared a hunger strike demanding recognitions of their political status. And since then, these hunger strikes by political prisoners in the Soviet Union became an annual occurrence, and from about the 1980s, the residents of Moscow, Leningrad, and other big cities in the Soviet Union joined in with rallies and demonstrations of support and solidarity. And as a child in the waning years of the Soviet Union, I grew up hearing the names and the life stories and the legends of the people who found courage to stand up against one of the most brutal and oppressive regimes in the history of the 20th century, who found courage to not just refuse to live by its lies, but to publicly and loudly speak the truth about the Soviet system in public demonstrations and samizdat publications, even though those publications and those few minutes on the square could cost them years in prisons and labor camps, in special psychiatric hospitals. The most famous of those dissident demonstrations came on August 25th of 1968. This was, of course, the month when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia to put down the Prague Spring. And official meetings were organized throughout the Soviet Union to demonstrate support for the invasion, or brotherly assistance, as it was referred to. At meetings all over the country, labor unions, professional associations, workers' collectives, academic institutes all voted in favor. Soviet newspapers reported that support for the action was unanimous. But then something happened. One afternoon that August, 7 people, 7 Russians, came out onto Red Square in Moscow to stage a silent demonstration of protest. The slogan they brought with them read, "За вашу и нашу свободу," for your freedom and ours, perhaps the most famous slogan of the Soviet dissident movement. They weren't on that square even for 5 minutes. They were attacked, arrested, and herded away almost immediately. But after what they did, no one could say that there was unanimous support among Soviet citizens for the invasion of Czechoslovakia. As the Prague newspaper Literárny Listy wrote, there are now at least 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people. A few years ago, I interviewed one of the 7, one of the demonstrators of 1968, for a documentary about the Soviet dissident movement, They Chose Freedom, which Dr. Young was kind to mention a few minutes ago. She has since passed away. Her name was Natalia Grobanevskaya. She was a poet, and she came to Red Square with her 3-month-old son. For her part in that demonstration, she got worse than prison. Years in a Soviet psychiatric institution with daily torture in the form of so-called treatment. I asked her why she did it, why she went, knowing for certain what the price would be. I'll never forget what she answered. She said, "For me, going to that demonstration was a selfish act. I wanted to have a clean conscience." Les dissidents soviétiques n'étaient qu'une petite poignée d'individus qui se dressaient contre un régime totalitaire avec une machine de répression constamment perfectionnée. Leur seule arme, c'était la parole. Mais à la fin des fins, on s'est trouvé que la parole était l'arme la plus puissante. Selon le grand humaniste russe Andrei Sakharov, ce n'est pas la question d'arithmétique, mais de qualité. Il s'agit de la destruction de la barrière psychologique de silence. Une fois cette barrière surmontée, il n'y a pas de retour en arrière. These people, the Soviet dissidents, were just a small handful standing up against a mighty totalitarian state armed with the world's most developed machine of repression. Their only weapon was their word. But in the end, as we know, they proved stronger. As the great Russian humanist Andrei Sakharov wrote, "It is not a case of arithmetic, but of a qualitative fact, the breach of a psychological barrier of silence. Once that barrier was breached, there was no going back. And with time, streams turned into rivers. And by the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 90s, it was no longer a handful of dissidents, but tens and hundreds of thousands of people who were going out to the streets all over Russia and the rest of the Soviet Union to demand freedom and dignity and to protest against the Soviet regime. I'll never forget the 3 days that ended the Soviet system, the 3 days in August of 1991, the 19th, the 20th, and the 21st. It began as an attempted hardline coup d'etat, staged by the top leadership of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and the KGB, the State Security Committee, with the goal of ending the experiments with democracy and perestroika and glasnost and going back to the bad old ways. The leaders of that coup had everything at their disposal. They had control of the government and party apparatus, newspapers, radio stations, and television channels. They had the whole might of the police, the military, and the KGB's overwhelming machine of repression. And of course, they had the tanks, which they sent into Moscow. Russian citizens, Muscovites, who refused to accept that coup, were not armed with anything except their dignity and their determination to defend their freedom. And so they went into the streets in the tens and the hundreds of thousands and stood in front of the tanks. And the tanks stopped and turned away. This was my first conscious political memory. I was 10 years old at the time, too young to join my father on the barricades by the Moscow White House, but certainly old enough to grasp and understand the lesson of what was happening. And the lesson was that however strong a dictatorship, when enough people are willing to stand up, they succeed. And then the tanks stop and turn away. This was a very powerful lesson, and I think it will stay with me for as long as I live. That same year, in 1991, the Russian parliament voted to make this day, today, October the 30th, Political Prisoner Day, to designate it as the National Remembrance Day for the victims of political repression in the Soviet Union. A unique occurrence in Russian history when an initiative started by dissidents was made official by the state. But then, of course, the 1990s were a unique time in Russia, a time when we could freely breathe, freely vote in genuine competitive elections, freely express our opinions without fear of consequence, listen to different viewpoints and to real news in objective, pluralistic, independent media. It was the only time in our modern history when Political Prisoner Day was redundant, because there were no political prisoners in Russia. The culminating moment of the democratic revolution of 1991 came on the evening of August 22nd, as tanks were leaving Moscow and as the defeated coup leaders were being transferred to prison. Thousands of people gathered on the Lubyanka Square in front of the KGB headquarters to pull down the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky. This is perhaps the most enduring image of the Russian democratic revolution, the monument to the founder of Soviet secret police hanging in a noose as a crane was taking it down from its pedestal. That same evening, a memorial plaque honoring Yuri Andropov was removed from the facade of the KGB building on the Lubyanka Square. Now, Andropov was a longtime chairman of the Soviet KGB, best known for setting up a special directorate tasked with suppressing and targeting political dissent, and also known and infamous for expanding the practice of punitive psychiatry, which I referred to earlier in relation to Natalia Grobanevskaya, when political dissidents, the people who opposed the Soviet regime, were labeled as mentally insane and kept in torturous conditions in psychiatric hospitals and special institutions. Russia is a country of symbols, and there was no place for a symbol of somebody like this in the new Russia. Just 8 short years later, the Russian Prime Minister came to that same spot on Lubyanka Square. This was on December the 20th, 1999, to officially unveil the restored plaque to Yuri Andropov, the very same plaque that had been dismantled in the August days of 1991. The Prime Minister was himself a former officer in the Soviet KGB. His name was Vladimir Putin, and just 11 days later he would become the acting president of Russia. For all those people asking that famous question, who is Mr. Putin, and what direction he would take our country, this was the answer. This was long before the worst abuses of the Putin regime in domestic or foreign policy, but the message was unmistakable. just as Putin's decision just a few months later to reinstate the Stalin-era Soviet national anthem as the national anthem of the Russian Federation. Again, Russia is a country of symbols. Symbols were very soon followed by substance, and what had been left of our nascent democracy was pretty much finished by the end of 2003. That was very much a turning point year, a pivotal year in transformation of Russia's imperfect democracy into a perfect authoritarianism that we live under today. That year, Mr. Putin did three things. In June, his government pulled the plug on the last nationwide independent television network, TVS. In October, Putin arrested Mikhail Khodorkovsky, Russia's richest man, the CEO of Yukos Oil Company, who had the tenacity to behave in an independent fashion to support opposition parties and civil society organizations and independent media. And his arrest was an unmistakable message to the rest of Russia's business community to stay away. And in December of that year, in December of 2003, for the first time since the end of Soviet rule, we had an election in Russia that was assessed by international monitors as not fair. The regime that rules our country today is very different from the Soviet one in many respects. No more official ideology, no more communist utopia, no more one-party state. And yet the essence is the same. It is a system that is based on repression and lies, where all of the major media outlets serve as mouthpieces of government propaganda, where elections are a meaningless ritual with predetermined results, where Parliament, in the apt description of its own speaker, is not a place for discussion, where attending a peaceful anti-government demonstration can land you in prison, where protesting against the authorities is not an exercise of constitutional right, but an act of personal courage. And once again, in Russia today, we have political prisoners. In his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, written in 1975, the speech that his wife Elena Bonner read out in Oslo because he was not allowed to go there, Andrei Sakharov listed by name 126 prisoners of conscience in the Soviet Union. Today, according to the Memorial Human Rights Center, according to the report released this day, the Political Prisoner Day, there are 195 political and religious prisoners in our country, and this is a conservative estimate. Here are just some of them. Oleg Sentsov, a Crimean film director who protested against the annexation. Anna Pavlikova and Maria Dubovik, two Moscow teenagers, kids almost, teenage girls, who were arrested for participating in an online opposition chat room. Oyub Titiev and Yuri Dmitriev, regional leaders of the Memorial organization, the leading human rights organization in Russia that has been designated by the Putin government as a foreign agent. Stanislav Zimovets, an activist who attended last year's anti-corruption demonstration in Moscow. And Alexei Pichugin, the remaining hostage of the Yukos case, who after more than 15 years is Russia's longest-serving political prisoner. Let us remember them, not only today on Political Prisoner Day, but every day. They are just a drop in the ocean, just a few among many. And I hope that the next time the leaders of the democratic nations of the West meet with Vladimir Putin for another summit or another conference or another round of talks, they find time to speak not just about oil and geopolitics, but also about those who are being unjustly held in Russia's prisons in violation of our country's international commitments on human rights. I haven't mentioned the West until now, because the topic of our conversation tonight is fighting for freedom in Russia, and that is not a task for the West. It is only for Russian citizens to change Russia, and we never ask for any outside support. The only thing we ask our friends in the West is that you stay true to your own values, is that you do not support the Putin regime by treating Mr. Putin as a respectable and worthy partner on the international stage, and by allowing his cronies to use your countries as havens for their looted wealth. Please stop enabling corruption and human rights abuse in Russia by welcoming their perpetrators on your soil and into your banking system. 1 year ago, Canada joined this growing international movement against impunity by passing the Magnitsky Act that imposed personal targeted sanctions, visa and financial sanctions, on foreign governments officials from any country who are implicated in corruption and human rights abuse. I'd like to thank the people, members of Parliament, and the Government of Canada for taking a principled position on this issue. It is my hope that this law continues to be implemented here in Canada to its full extent, and that other Western democracies follow your example by sending this very clear message that the crooks and the human rights abusers are no longer welcome. C'est aux citoyens russes de changer la Russie. La seule chose qu'on demande à l'Occident, c'est qu'il adhère à ses propres valeurs, qu'il arrête de supporter M. Poutine en le traitant comme un partenaire respectable dans l'arène politique mondiale et en créant un refuge pour les escrocs de M. Poutine et leurs actifs obtenus illégalement. Il y a un an, le Canada a adopté la loi Magnitsky, introduisant les sanctions personnelles contre les fonctionnaires des gouvernements étrangers impliqués dans la corruption et les violations des droits de l'homme. Je voudrais remercier le peuple et le gouvernement du Canada d'avoir adopté cette position de principe sur ce sujet. J'espère voir cette loi appliquée dans son intégralité et j'espère voir d'autres pays occidentaux suivre votre exemple en envoyant un message très clair que les escrocs et les violateurs des droits de l'homme ne sont plus les bienvenus. So much of Russia's history and so much of what we have been and will be speaking about tonight was about dictatorship, oppression, corruption, abuse of power. And yet the history of Russia also has one remarkable feature, and that is that in every era, however strong the oppression, however sweeping the censorship, you will always find people in Russia who are prepared to stand up for freedom, justice, and truth. People like Natalia Gorbanevskaya and her friends who came out on Red Square in August 1968. People like Andrei Sakharov and other Soviet dissidents. People like Boris Nemtsov, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, who became the most clear, the most effective, the most powerful voice in opposition to the corruption and abuses of the Putin regime. It was the greatest privilege of my life to have worked with him for more than 15 years, from the late 1990s and until that wretched evening in February of 2015, when he was killed by 5 bullets in the back as he walked across a bridge in front of the Kremlin. When all else fails, when the threats and the smears don't work, they use bullets as the final argument. Just a few months earlier, Boris Nemtsov led a march through the streets of Moscow against Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. I'll never forget that day in September of 2014, when Moscow's boulevard ring, both sides of it, all the way from Pushkin Square down to Sakharov Avenue, was filled with tens of thousands of people, Russian people, who came out to say, no, not in my name. And when those of us in front had reached the end point, people were still lining up to join the rally at the beginning. In the last few months, in fact, over these last year and a half, we have once again seen thousands of people on the streets of Russia. All over the country, from Kaliningrad to Khabarovsk, Russian citizens have been going to the streets to protest against the corruption and the abuse of power and the impunity of the Putin regime, and against the sheer fact that one person has now been in power for almost 2 decades, longer than Leonid Brezhnev, the symbol of Soviet totalitarian stagnation. The vast majority of these protesters were young people, representatives of the next generation, representatives of the future of Russia, people in their late teens and early 20s, high school students, university students. I think this is a very, very, very worrying sign for the Putin regime, but I think it's a very hopeful sign for the future of Russia. Au cours de ces derniers 18 mois, on a vu des milliers de personnes sur les rues de la Russie. Tout à travers du pays, de Kaliningrad à Khabarovsk, les gens sont sortis sur les rues pour dire non à la corruption, pour dire non à l'abus de pouvoir du Kremlin. La plupart de ces manifestants étaient des jeunes, des représentants de la future génération, les écoliers et les étudiants universitaires. Et je crois que c'est une raison de s'inquiéter pour le régime de M. Poutine, mais une raison de l'espoir pour l'avenir de notre pays. Our work at the Open Russia movement is mainly with these young people, the representatives of the generation that will take charge of Russia after Vladimir Putin. Through our training and education programs, through our projects aimed at encouraging political participation and civic engagement, we want to empower them and help them become active and informed citizens. We want to help them gain the experience, the civic and political experience they will need when they face the task of building a new Russia on the ruins of yet another authoritarian system. As part of this experience building, we are putting candidates in elections all across the country, not to win, because that today is impossible, but to learn how to campaign, how to walk door to door, how to speak at rallies, organize local activists, speak about local issues, publish leaflets in newspapers, and so on and so forth. Like the famed Soviet pianist Rudolf Kara, who spent 13 years of internal exile in Kazakhstan practicing on a pretend keyboard he had carved out of a plank of wood so that his fingers wouldn't forget. We are using what instruments and what tools we have today to help these youngsters prepare for a time when they will be able to do the real thing. We know, as Soviet dissidents did, that this is not a question of arithmetic, but of breaching that psychological barrier. We know that with time, streams turn into rivers. We know that however strong a dictatorship, when enough people are willing to stand up, they succeed. We know that one day, Russia will have a government that respects the rights and freedoms of its citizens and that plays a constructive role in international affairs. And we will continue to do everything we can to try to bring that day a little bit closer. Thank you very much.
Unfortunately, my mic fell off, so I just want to make sure that my voice is coming through. Okay.
And I hope mine is as well. I'm not sure if I need to push anything. Is mine okay? Can you hear me?
Okay. Thank you, Vladimir, very much for this inspiring presentation. I think one of the most powerful elements that comes out is the courage that is required to stand for rights and freedoms. I recall as a young undergraduate student reading Bukowski's book, To Build a Castle, about how to stand for something. And it inspired me as a young man that led me to study the dissident movement in the Soviet Union. You yourself demonstrate that courage that is needed. Given your own circumstances and the lives of the dissidents that you have studied, how do people find that courage? Where does it come from?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure if it's courage or stubbornness. I would say we're stubborn rather than courageous. And also I think perhaps we're a little selfish in the sense that Natalia Gobanevskaya meant it, in the sense that I referred earlier when I quoted her saying that for her going to that demonstration was a selfish act because she wanted to have a clean conscience. And I think actually that is the most powerful motivation that there is. What we certainly are, whatever else we may be, what we certainly are is unwilling to be complicit in the crimes of a regime that claims to speak on behalf of our country. And once again, just as in Soviet times, they pretend that everybody's saying yes, that everybody agrees. They come up with these bogus poll numbers and these bogus official election results that apparently everybody loves Mr. Putin, which is, needless to say, not the case in reality. But I just feel, and I know so many of my colleagues feel, that if we just stood idly by and watched what was happening and did nothing about it, then we would be complicit also in what was happening and what this regime was doing. And we do not want to be complicit in what they're doing to our country and to the rest of the world. And so I think the only choice, the only option is to go and do something about it. And everybody does what they can, whether by joining demonstrations or writing and publishing, or by running in elections, even in today's conditions, or by engaging in international advocacy, or by making films, writing books, whatever anyone can do to make their voice heard and to to express their opinions. I think it is important because at the end of the day, you know, it's not about. I had, thanks to your colleagues, a wonderful tour of your museum earlier today. My first time here, as I mentioned, and I think one of my strongest impressions was of this poster with that famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr., that when that day comes, we're going to remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. Well, I think we have no right to be silent, and we have to do everything we can to make sure that people everywhere, not just in our country, but in the world as well, realize that when the Kremlin claims to speak on behalf of the whole of Russia, they're lying, because they're not.
So let's unpack a little bit. In the Russian context, we had this decade of democratic optimism and enthusiasm. We saw the tanks, the people stopping the tanks. The prospects for democracy looked very strong in 1991, 92, into 93. Then came some elections, some stalled economic reforms, or maybe not the returns people hoped for. I remember by 1997, 98, there was a famous Russian slogan, «Хотелось как можно лучше, но получилось как всегда»,
Right.
meaning we wanted everything to be good or so much better, and we just got the same old, same old. Is that a fair translation?
Yeah, we just got the usual.
Yeah, the
and
usual.
Prime Minister Chernomyrdin coined that
Yes.
phrase.
How do we explain the stumbles or the failures of that time?
So frankly, I don't even know where to begin with listing what I think were the mistakes and the blunders that were committed by the democratic leadership in Russia in the early 1990s. But let's first of all not forget that it was a democratic leadership, and for that whole decade of the 1990s, it was, as I mentioned earlier, that unique time in the history of Russia when we did have free and competitive elections, whose results we didn't actually know in advance. That's a novel concept in Russia today under Vladimir Putin. When we did have a parliament that was a place for discussion, and that represented the widest spectrum of political views across society. When we had a media that was free to report real news and free to speak its mind. And, you know, at the moment Mr. Putin came to power, most of the national television channels in Russia were not controlled by the government. They were independent and privately owned. So first of all, before I begin to talking about the mistakes and the problems, let's not forget that it was a time of hope and it was a time of freedom. And I'm so grateful to have lived in that time and to have seen it, because, you know, let's not forget we now have an entire generation of Russians who've grown up not knowing anything except Mr. Putin and his regime, because he's been in power. In December, we're going to mark 19 years since he came to power. That's a whole generation. The people who turned voting age, turned 18 this year, and came to vote in a so-called presidential election in March of 2018 were people who were born under Vladimir Putin. This is how long he stayed in power. And so what's actually amazing is that the people who have been going to protest all over the country this past year, other people, most of whom have never seen anything except Putin. So you would think that would be the brainwashed generation, the generation will be most susceptible to his propaganda, but in fact they're the ones who are going to the streets and increasingly saying enough. And then that is a very hopeful sign indeed. But going back to the 90s, I think the biggest mistake, we can go on for a long time about this, but I think the biggest mistake that the Russian democratic leadership of the 90s made was that they didn't finish the job of fully cleansing, fully turning the page on our communist and our Soviet past. They didn't finish the job that our neighbors in Central and Eastern Europe did finish. Of course, in so many countries across the former Warsaw Bloc, you've had, in some countries, you've had lustrations, which were the bans on profession for former communist operatives and officers in the repressive services of the communist regime. You've had full opening of the archives. You had a full reckoning with the past. This is something that began to happen in our country but didn't finish.
Stopped cold.
Yes, stopped about halfway. So initially, I mentioned that in 1991, today, this day, October the 30th, was designated as National Remembrance Day for victims of Soviet political repression. The law that did this also did some other things, including, for example, establishing the possibility for criminal answering criminal responsibility for the people who had been involved in those repressions. It wasn't just to remember the victims, it was also to hold the people who were responsible for the repressions accountable. This never went beyond the letter. There was a trial at the Russian Constitutional Court throughout 1991 and 1992. It was the Communist Party against President Yeltsin. So soon after the victory in August of 91, President Yeltsin banned the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The communists then went and sued him in the Russian Constitutional Court, arguing that the ban was illegal. And as a result of the communists going to court and suing, what they got was an official verdict by the Constitutional Court of the Russian Federation that was issued on November 30th, 1992, that officially declared that the Soviet communist regime had been responsible for repressions against millions of people. This is not my opinion or yours. This is not a statement by an NGO or a human rights group. This is a verdict by the highest court in the Russian Federation at the time. This was before we joined the Council of Europe. Now, highest court is the European Court of Human Rights. Back then, it was the Russian Constitutional Court. We had a partial opening of the Soviet archives. So as part of that trial, Vladimir Bukovsky, whom you just mentioned, who served as an expert for President Yeltsin, got access to some of the documents in the Communist Party archives. And there was a poll conducted in 1992 by FCIOM, the All-Russian Public Opinion Research Center, which showed that most Russians, more than 50%, favored restricting former operatives of the communist regime and the KGB from holding positions of power. And that same year, in 1992, there was a lustration bill introduced into the Russian parliament by Galina Starovoitova, a prominent liberal lawmaker from St. Petersburg. But then everything stopped, either through the inability or the unwillingness of the Russian leadership to
perhaps
pursue.
the busy agenda of so many other things.
There are many things. Among other things, actually, as Bukovsky said publicly many times, people, for some reason, very often assume that the West always played a very helpful role in this, and that was not always the case. And for example, as Bukovsky said, many Western leaders actually put pressure, enormous pressure on President Yeltsin not to fully open the communist archives, before they were afraid of what they're going to find there about their own past dealings with the Kremlin. And so that was one reason. And since we are talking about the West, I think there was one other important reason for the failure of the Russian democratic transition in the 90s. And don't get me wrong, in no way I'm trying to blame, the failure of Russian democratic transition in the West. That would have been too easy and also inaccurate. But there was, I think, one huge mistake that the West made back in the 90s. And it was, as you remember, Václav Havel said that for a lot of Central and Eastern Europe, post-communist transformation was not just about return to democracy, but also about a return to Europe. This was his direct quote in his address to the US Congress. I think it was in 1990. So for so many of these countries, and I know this having spoken to many friends from the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, Poland, so many of these countries, this prospect of fully rejoining European and Euro-Atlantic institutions served as a powerful impetus, a powerful incentive for reforms that allowed them to overcome the difficulties and stay the course. Russia never had that prospect. We never had that full prospect of European integration that our neighbors did. And I can give you just one small example, but I think that illustrates very well what the problem was. On December the 26th, 1991, the next day after the red flag came down on the Kremlin for the very last time, the next day after the formal dissolution of the Soviet Union, there was a North Atlantic Council meeting in Brussels at NATO headquarters, chaired by the then Secretary General of NATO, Manfred Werner. And in the middle of the meeting, the Russian ambassador walks in. And he approaches the Secretary General, and he hands in a letter signed by the President of the Russian Federation, Boris Yeltsin, officially addressed to the Secretary General of NATO, raising the question of future Russian membership in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He did not even receive a response. And this was just one small illustration of how the West also made a mistake of not being willing and ready to fully open its arms to a new democratic Russia.
So I know you're a student of democracy. You're not only a courageous activist, but you love to study. So I know in your time in the UK, you like to visit parliamentary buildings and to see government at work. In the United States, you've done the same. Yesterday, you very much wanted to visit the legislative building.
And thank you so much for making that
here
possible.
In Manitoba. As a student of democracy, and as someone who has some experience in the West as well, do we take democracy for granted here in Canada?
Well, I think yes, but it's not necessarily a fault. It's just a natural thing. I think it's just like oxygen, like air. When we have it, we just breathe it. We don't pay attention to it. It's natural. It's when it begins to lack, begins to go away, you really start noticing this. And so I think in a lot of Western democracies, people take their freedoms and their democracies for granted. And this is why I think it's so important for people that have the freedoms and the rights and the opportunities that we are only fighting for. I think it's so important for people in the West to remember that the vast majority of the population of our planet actually lives in despotic totalitarian regimes. There was this, I saw recently, it was actually at the Oslo Freedom Forum where both you and I were a few months ago. They showed this absolutely astonishing and mind-boggling figures and graphics that showed how many people are affected by natural disasters, by droughts, by hunger, by diseases, and all the other problems that are facing our world today. And all of these numbers pale in comparison to the sheer number of people who live under despotic and totalitarian regimes. And I think it is so important not to forget that for people who live in democratic nations. And this is why I always try to make a point, and I thank you so much for this opportunity to do this here today, to say at least some of the names and show at least some of the faces of the political prisoners in Russia, because it's important to remember that it's not just some general problems about some general things. These are specific people, real people, who are sitting in prison as we sit here with you in this hall.
So the demonstration you referred to in Red Square in 1968 was Nashu Ivashu Svobodu. How would you drive that point home to Canadians? Why should Canadians care so much about what happens in Russia? Is it kind of this indivisible concept of human rights?
Well, that is of course very important, and human rights are by their nature universal, and it's, as we can talk about, for example, all the United Nations principles and Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights that applies to all UN member states, but in Russia's case and in Canada's case, we can talk about even more, because, for example, both Canada and Russia are members of the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, and that organization has very clear commitments on human rights and rule of law and democracy that all member states, including Canada and Russia, have signed up to. So it's also important to remember that every time the Putin regime rigs an election or beats up peaceful demonstrators or muzzles the media, they violate not just Russian laws, but also international commitments. But this is kind of a philosophical point, if you will, though it's a very important one. There's also a very practical aspect to this. And so I think the answer to your question was actually provided by many heads of state and government in the Western world who have for so many years turned a blind eye on the domestic authoritarian abuses of the Putin regime in the hope to find some sort of an accommodation or to strike some sort of deals with him on the international arena. Turned a blind eye to the media censorship and the election fraud and the political repression in Russia. You know, offering him red carpet treatment, inviting him for summits, inviting him for visits, and so on and so forth. And apart from, in my view, being completely immoral, especially for countries that keep saying that they pride themselves on their adherence to the rule of law and respect for human rights and democracy, and yet they completely turned a blind eye for so many years on the abuses by the Putin regime of those values inside of Russia. But apart from being immoral, it's in my view, and not just in my view now, but everybody sees it, it's very impractical too, because one undeniable aspect of the modern history of Russia is that domestic repression is inevitably followed by external aggression. There's absolutely no reason to expect a government that violates its own laws and abuses the rights of its own people to then respect international norms or the interests of other countries. It's not going to. And sure enough, those Western leaders who have for years turned a blind eye on the abuses of democracy inside of Russia have one day woken up to the first territorial annexation in Europe since the end of the Second World War, which Mr. Putin accomplished with Crimea. So I think there is a much better answer to your question than I could ever provide.
Thank you very much, Vladimir. I think this would be a great time to invite some questions from members in the audience. And we're going to have Angela kind of monitor the questioning.
I'm back, and I'm back to encourage these to be questions. We'd like to be able to take as many as possible. We have a roaming mic in the middle of the room over there, so if you want to just signal, someone will bring the mic over to you. And we also have some questions that are coming in from social media. So let's start with a question in the room.
Hi, I'm a human rights advocate, and I'm actually wondering, what is it that you think gives some people courage to stand up? I've traveled to civil rights and human rights museums all over the world, and it's the one burning question I see. They all pretty much follow some pattern, with no disrespect to this museum, but there's a certain pattern to it. And when you show the humans, what is it that makes some people able to survive abuse and others crumble? And I haven't found that answer in any museum, and I'm just wondering why some people, whether it was in the Holocaust, whether it was in Rwanda, Chile, Why? Russia, why? I'm hoping you might know.
Thank you for the question. I think, first of all, I don't think it's a matter of choice. So John asked earlier also what motivates us, and actually I don't even know how to begin to answer that question, because it's not like, we sit down and think, okay, this is what I'm going to do. It just kind of, I just see what's happening. I see the injustice and the repression and the constant lies and, the whole nature protest against. We have to do something about it. And as I said earlier, if we just stay silent, even if we stay silent, I'm not even talking about people who are supporting these things. I'm saying if we just stay silent, we would also be complicit. And if we want to talk about motivation, it's a very strong and very powerful motivation to have a clean conscience, as Natalia Gorbanevska said it, to not be complicit in the crimes of a regime that claims to speak on behalf of your country. And, John mentioned a few minutes ago the book by Vladimir Bukovsky, To Build a Castle. It's a seminal book. I would recommend it to anybody who's interested in the 20th century history of Russia, and not just of Russia, but of the global movement for democracy. First of all, it's a brilliantly written book, and also I hope it's well translated into English. Obviously, read it in the original, but it's brilliantly written, and it's fascinating. And one of the things he writes there is, he said, which could be a partial answer to your question. He wrote that when people think in this crowd mentality, when they think, why me? And nothing happens. But when each person begins to think individually, and instead of asking, why me, he or she asks, who if not me, then things begin to change. And then each person, each of those people, becomes more powerful than whatever he or she is standing up against. And at the end of the day, it's that old French saying from the 19th century, do what you must and come what may. I get often asked, am I optimistic, am I hopeful for the future of Russia? And honestly, every time I say, yes, I am, because in the last 4 years, I've traveled almost, across the entire country from the Baltic to the Baikal. I haven't quite made it to the Pacific yet, but I've seen so many people in all the regions that I've been to who are not only fed up with this regime, but are ready to do something about it, who are ready to work for change. And so many of these people are young people. And so, yes, I am hopeful and I am positive about the future of Russia. But even if I wasn't, I think I'll still be doing what I do, because do what you must and come what may. Even if there's no hope, I still, well, forgive me for sounding maybe a little bit overconfident and over-arrogant, but I think what we do is right. And what these guys do is wrong. And so somebody like Boris Nemtsov, who was one of the top-level government officials in Russia, and who had all the opportunities to find, a plum and comfortable position under the current regime, or in the worst case, to leave the country, he chose to stay, and he chose to fight, because I know that was a very powerful motivation for him, to not be complicit, to do the right thing, and to do what you must and to come what may. I think that's the main thing that drives us forward.
I'm going to just remind you, we don't have a microphone, and unfortunately everyone will not be able to hear a question, but we do have another question over here on the other side of the room, and we do have a question about complicity coming in from Twitter, so we'll allow that following the woman to the
I'll make sure to answer.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Hi. Sorry, I'm going to yell into this. You were saying that the West had made a mistake by not welcoming Russia back into the political community. How can they, do you think that gate is closed now, or what would, or what would you recommend?
Thank you very much. That's a crucial question. First, I'll just briefly answer the question was why do some people, I guess, choose to be complicit? It's not for me to judge. Everybody makes their own decisions, and maybe they're not even decisions, as I said. I don't think I ever made, when I did this oral history interview for your museum yesterday, Jeremy, the interviewer, asked, how and why did you decide to do what you do? And I kind of paused and I said, well, I'm not sure I decided to do this. It's just, well, what else could we do? I just feel that's right. Somebody else may feel something different, so it's not for me to judge anybody. I can just speak for myself. But your question is very, very important. Thank you for raising it. So we were speaking about the 90s earlier, and there were important mistakes, significant mistakes made, both domestically in Russia, which was the main reason for the failure, but also mistakes made by the West, which was not the main reason, but which was an important contributing factor to the failure of Russia's democratic transition. So I think what's most important for both of us, actually now, both us in Russia and you in the West, to learn from those mistakes and not to repeat them again. And so the bulk of our work, work of the Open Russia movement back home in Russia, is, as I mentioned earlier, about working with this new generation, the young generation of civil society and democracy activists, to try to help them gain the political experience, to make them at least a little bit more prepared for that future transition. And also the other thing we do in preparations is we actually work on deliberating on some of the substantive proposals for future reform. So for example, we had several working groups under the auspices of Open Russia working on energy sector reform, on economic demonopolization, on constitutional reforms that will need to be implemented. Because, you know, we do not know. One thing about Russian history is that it's notoriously difficult to predict. Just think back to 1905, 1917, 1991. Almost nobody predicted that massive change. Or more recently in 2011 and 12, the massive winter of protest against Putin. Nobody predicted that. So we do not know when or how the Putin regime is going to end. But we know that it will, because nothing is forever. These guys are no exception. And so what we can do now is to try to lay the groundwork to make those preparations, because when things start changing, it's far too late to sit down and try to work out, okay, what do we do now? We have to lay that groundwork today, and this is what we're trying to do the best we can in Russia. But I also think it's important, and this goes to your question, I also think it's important for our friends and colleagues in the West to also draw the conclusions and learn from the lessons of the 90s. And so the next time that Russia embarks on a democratic transition, which again will happen, we do not know when or how, but it will. And when it does, I think it's important for our friends and partners in the West to stand ready to welcome that future democratic Russia into their ranks as a full member and full partner in the European and Euro-Atlantic community. So we both have to learn from our mistakes, and we both have to begin to prepare for that day when things in Russia start changing. And that goes for the West too, and thank you so much for your question.
So I'm going to take a question from Facebook, and then I see there's a hand at the back of the room and a hand at the front of the room. But we'll start with Facebook. And I think this was maybe a comment, and maybe embedded in it is a question. So from Facebook, say what you will, Putin loves his country and is admired by many. Media never lets us hear the other side. Would you like to respond to this comment?
First of all, to the gentleman and lady who asked the question, I wish he or she went to my country and really see the media that doesn't tell you the other side. I actually find it pretty offensive when people try to make moral equivalences between state-run propaganda, which we have, and the fake news or whatever you want to call it in Western democracies. But to the substance of the question, I can think of nothing more untrue and offensive than to say that Putin loves Russia. You know, when these people try to pose themselves as patriots of Russia, you know, do you love somebody that you're stealing from? For years, they've been robbing the Russian people of their wealth, of their resources, of their future. You know, these people around Putin have, in a matter of years, become dollar billionaires out of nothing. Where did this come from, I wonder? So all they think about our country, all they do with our country is they treat it as means for their personal enrichment. I would not call that love. I would call that anything but love. And so first of all, I'm afraid that's simply not true, the comment that you just quoted. And as for the fact of Putin's supposed popularity, I hear this very often, that yeah, but you know, he's supported by the vast majority of Russians. You know, you speak, meaning me, just for a small minority of people. A good friend of mine, Boris Vishnevsky, who is a member of the Legislative Assembly in St. Petersburg, one of the very few opposition lawmakers in Russia today, he said that when he was asked this question about Putin's high opinion poll ratings, he said that Nicolae Ceausescu, the Romanian communist dictator, had 99% approval 2 weeks before his overthrow. And you know, I went back and actually fact-checked this. I'm a historian, so maybe that's why I feel compelled to do this. I went back and fact-checked this because I thought this was just a nice-sounding phrase, which I would repeat anyway because it's nice-sounding. But I went back and fact-checked, and it's actually true. The official poll ratings was 99%. This is to say that opinion poll ratings are completely meaningless in authoritarian states. When so many people lack access to objective information, because every single nationwide television channel in Russia today is directly controlled by the government. But more importantly than that, when most people would be afraid to openly state their opinions. And just think about this for a second. You sit in your home, in your kitchen, somewhere in Russia. You know what's happening. You know that people who oppose the government are denounced as traitors and foreign agents, that they're attacked, arrested, beaten, exiled, or sometimes killed. And you know all this, and you get a phone call in your house, or even worse, a knock on your door. Somebody who knows either your phone number or where you live, and they come in and they say, hello, I'm from a polling agency. What do you think of Vladimir Putin? What are you going to say? This is utterly meaningless. as are the bogus election results that they come up with. You know, when there's no genuine opposition on the ballot, it's not hard to win an election when your opponents are not on the ballot, right? So that's meaningless as well. I think a much better way of judging the real position of this regime is by its own behavior. I know I'm the one who's supposed to be asked the questions, but may I ask one question back? And it's a rhetorical one. If he really had 86%, as Putin claims he has, why does he need to rig elections all the time? Wouldn't he just go and win them? Why does he feel compelled to not let his opponents on the ballot? Why does he need to censor the media? Why does his police beat up and arrest peaceful opposition demonstrators who just come out to express their opinions? To me, that doesn't speak to the behavior of a strong and popular government. That speaks to a regime that is weak and insecure. And looking at all those thousands of young people that have been demonstrating against this regime over the past years, I can see why they feel weak and insecure.
Thank you. So at the back of the room, we had a question.
Thank you. First, I want to say I admire your courage and appreciate your optimism. And you've been hinting at this. And I wonder, many of us in the West, when we think of Putin, we think of the recent acts in Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, and as well as the US election. And I'm wondering, is Putin ascendant? Are these signs, are these demonstrations of strength? Or is it a false strength? And I appreciate that you were just kind of addressing this. But.
Thank you so much. Well, I think everything that Putin has been doing in foreign policy is a direct consequences and a direct reflection of his domestic policy. And so domestic repression and external aggression in Russia traditionally go hand in hand. As, by the way, do the opposites. Actually, I think it's important to mention too. So when Russia is democratic domestically, it also has a much more open, much more pro-European, much more friendly foreign policy. And I think the best example of that is the pivotal role that Russian President Boris Yeltsin played in helping to secure the independence of the Baltic states in the early 1990s, which they still remember. And they still, you know, every time I go to Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, I go to see a bas-relief honoring the role of the President of Russia in securing the peaceful independence of the Baltic states. And I see so many Western tourists reading and kind of staying there in bewilderment, because in the year 2018, it's impossible to imagine how a president of Russia could help achieve independence of a Soviet captive state. That is exactly what he did. And so the opposites go together as well. But for now, of course, it's the repression and the aggression that go together. And so what Putin's been doing with Ukraine, with Syria, earlier with Georgia, now his heavy involvement, for example, in African countries, in Central Africa. You know, the 3 journalists who were killed a few months ago, Russian journalists who were in the Central African Republic, to investigate the activities of a pro-Kremlin or Kremlin-linked mercenary group in that country. And we have almost no doubt that their murder was directly the result of the subject of our investigation. And many other things that maybe are below the radar, not as much noticeable as Ukraine and Syria, but all of that are just reflections of what this regime is about. That, you know, that they're about repression at home and aggression abroad. And this vain hope that so many Western leaders had for so many years, that let Putin do what he does domestically, whatever he wants to do domestically, and we'll find some sort of a modus vivendi with him on the international stage, that does not work. And I hope now, in the year 2018, everybody understands that it doesn't work, even those who would engage in reset and look into his eyes and see his soul and all the rest of it. And so I think that, I'm sorry to say, but until this regime remains in power, we're going to continue to see more of this. That this regime has absolutely no potential of reforming itself. We're going to see more repression at home and more aggression abroad. And going back to the question that John asked earlier, why should Westerners care about democracy and human rights in Russia? Well, the short answer to this is that because, you know, when democracy returns to Russia, needless to say, it will be above all for the benefit of us, of Russian citizens, because we will have our rights and freedoms respected. But it will also be to the advantage of the entire international community to have a government in Russia that respects the rights and freedoms of its own citizens and that behaves as a responsible member of the international community. And those things go together as well.
So we have another question on the floor, but as the microphone is approaching, we have another question from YouTube, and I just thought I would bring it forward now because it has an international flavor to it as well, and it is linked to contemporary issues. So the question reads as follows. What similarities do you see in the conduct of Putin and his opponents compared to the Saudi monarchy in the Khashoggi issue? Where do we go from here?
Well, in this sense, unfortunately, all totalitarian and despotic regimes are similar, in that when they cannot scare or bribe their opponents, it's usually the other way around. When they fail to bribe, they try to scare. When they fail to scare, they kill. And if we look at the long list of independent journalists, civil society activists, and political opposition leaders in Russia who have lost their lives in one way or another since Mr. Putin came to power, I think that's the answer to your question. And the assassination of Boris Nemtsov in February of 2015 was the most brazen and the most high-profile political assassination in the modern history of Russia. The most prominent leader of the political opposition, gunned down 200 meters from the Kremlin wall. You know, we kept thinking, a lot of people kept thinking, I shouldn't say we, a lot of people kept thinking before then that, you know, every time Putin would cross another line, people would say, okay, if he crossed that line, but surely, you know, he's not going to go to X and Y. Then he would do something else, then he would do X. And people say, okay, but he's not going to go to Y. Then, of course, he did the Y. And then it went on and on. Well, after the leader of the opposition is assassinated 200 meters from the Kremlin, there are no other lines. And they can do whatever they feel they can get away with.
Thank you. So we have a question over here. And then, Gabriella, we had one with the red scarf over here. And I think then we'll have time for one more question, and then we're going to wrap the Q&A period. So please go ahead with your question.
Thank you. You've stated a number of times tonight, and rightly so, that the future, the positive future for Russia is with the young generation. But it looks like a lot of that generation have chosen another option, and that is emigration. What is your view on that option?
Thank you so much for your question. I think you know what my view on that option is since I'm back in Russia and continuing my work, but it's a very profound question. Thank you for raising it. So I sometimes get asked when I'm in an international audience, people ask that, you know, Putin has returned so many things that existed back in the Soviet times, like the media censorship, the lack of free and fair elections, political prisoners, and many other things. So when is he finally going to reinstate the Iron Curtain and close the borders? And I say never, because this regime is happy that so many Russians are leaving. Because the kind of people that are leaving are usually the young, the educated, people who care, the kinds of people who would be going out to protest and demonstrate if they hadn't left. And so this regime would like all of us to go and to leave. And you know what? That's why we're not going to do this. I think there's nothing better the Putin regime would like us to do than just to give up and run. And we're not going to give them that pleasure. And this is why, you know, so many of us, and again, like I answered the lady's question previously, don't get me wrong, I'm not judging anybody. It's everybody's personal choice, whether to stay or to leave. And actually many of us, including me, have had to take the precaution of having our families outside of Russia, so my wife and children are not in Russia because of what I do. But I think those of us who are the public faces of the Russian opposition have no right to go away. And so that is why, you know, as soon as I recovered from the first poisoning, I went back and resumed my work. As soon as, actually this took much longer after the second poisoning. I was only able to go back to Russia literally a few weeks ago. But I did, and it was a question of principle, because, again, they would love us all to run away, and then, you know, nothing, well, I'm not going to say nothing would change, because things would still change, but I think it would certainly make change more difficult. And you can see this even as, I know it's like a tiny, small thing, but even in small illustrations. So every time I come back to Russia, I go through passport control in the airport. I'm a Russian citizen. I go back to my country. I spent about 40 minutes standing next to that officer in passport control, and he or she's looking at the computer, also like with a fear on their face. I don't know what's there because the screen is turned the other way. But they look, they call somebody, they speak to somebody. I don't know what they're doing. In the end, they do stamp the passport, and I go. Every time I fly from Russia, 10 seconds out of here. I think there's a message in that, and we're not going to follow that message. Not getting rid of us that easily.
Thank you. Thank you so much for what you've said today. You are inspiring. And I hope you don't suffer repercussions for the kinds of things you're saying in Canada that may be reported back. But my question is about something else. Many regimes, when they change, go through a very bloody time. Most times, maybe even. And my question is about nonviolence. I see what you've said about the terrible, violent tactics of Putin. And I see mainly from what you said the very peaceful demonstrations. do you have any hope for nonviolent means to evoke change in Russia? Or do you expect that there's going to be a violent kind of regime change? Or is there a third option?
Thank you so much. That's a very important question. First of all, I'll say at the outset that our means are exclusively nonviolent. It's a question of principle, that our movement is a peaceful, nonviolent movement, as was the Soviet dissident movement back in the day. And in that documentary that John referred to, They Chose Freedom, which is now in a collection of this museum, so it's available in the library here. It's also online. It's a documentary about the Soviet dissident movement. And one of the questions that I wanted to kind of raise there was, how did they make that choice back in the 60s when the Soviet dissident movement emerged, late 50s even, to be a nonviolent movement? Because there were some hotheads who advocated, more forceful, shall we say, methods. And yet the point of view that prevailed, the point of view that was articulated by people like Alexander Yesenin-Volpin and Vladimir Bukovsky and many others, said, no. We have to let them be cruel, let them be violent, let them be lawbreakers. We will be law-abiding. Even if the other side doesn't abide their own laws and their own constitution, we will. One of the famous slogans of the Soviet dissident movement, except for your freedom and ours that I mentioned, the second most famous slogan was, respect your own constitution. And they did. And Sofia Kalistratova, who was, she was one of the few Soviet lawyers who dared to defend dissidents in courts. And she would always advise them. She said, that's an advice that we still very much like to follow. She would say to them, anybody else can cross the street on red light, you must only cross on green. Don't give any pretext. You have to follow the law to the smallest minutiae, and we do this. And we are, in principle, nonviolent and peaceful. Because, frankly, well, first of all, it's wrong in principle, but also nothing good comes out of it. And there's this old Stalinist principle that the means justify the ends. Well, we reject that. We think the means actually shape the ends. And it depends. Look what happened in October of 1917, and look what followed. So, no, we absolutely do not advocate any kind of forceful or violent overthrow of the regime. And yet there's a deep irony in everything the Kremlin has been doing with regard to the opposition, because the current regime, the Putin regime, likes to accuse us, Russian opposition leaders and Russian opposition activists, of trying to foment some kind of a revolution, some kind of a Maidan uprising in Russia. Well, if there is anybody who's preparing the ground for a revolution in Russia, surely it's the people who have destroyed elections as a meaningful institution, who have destroyed parliament, who have shut down all independent media, who are beating people up for peacefully demonstrating. So in other words, the people who are closing off all the normal, peaceful, constitutional avenues for change, they are the ones preparing revolutions, not us. We don't want, again, any violent overthrows. We want a peaceful constitutional transition. We would want, ideally, something like a round table in Poland in 1989 that paved the way for democratic transition in that country. So the question of which way this regime is going to end, I think it will be more appropriate to address it to the other side, because as far as we're concerned, we want a peaceful, constitutional, and a smooth transition, as peaceful and smooth as possible. And we're going to do everything we can to make sure that's the way it happens. But not everything depends on us.
Thank you. So we're going to take one last question over here.
First of all, welcome, and I think I can speak for everybody in thanking you for coming here. So I think a major theme of this talk has been the West's role in Russian democracy and a potential transition, and you mentioned the 90s as well and sort of the failed transition. And you mentioned the Canadian version of the Magnitsky Act. Recent academic research in Canada has shown that the act's being implemented in sort of a lukewarm manner. I don't know if you know this, but actually the Globe and Mail busted a story in which Vladimir Yakunin, the head of Russian Railways, was never put on the sanctions list because of his relationship with Bombardier, a Canadian company, as well as this.
I did read about that, yeah.
Yeah, and Oleg Deripaska continues to be a major shareholder in Magna International, a Canadian company, and Roman Abramovich owns a major steel company in Canada. So the actual seizure of assets hasn't actually happened to a significant extent. These oligarchs continue to profit off of their Canadian assets. And so what I'm wondering is, if you had the opportunity to speak with the Prime Minister and perhaps the Minister of Foreign Affairs who's responsible for this, what would you say to them, and what more can Canada do in this respect? Thank you.
Thank you. And let me applaud the question as well, and thank you for raising it. That's a crucial issue. So It's one thing to have the law on the books, which is extremely important in itself. There are only 6 Western countries who have the Magnitsky Law on the books. They're the US, Canada, the United Kingdom, and the 3 Baltic states. This is it. We are working in several other countries with members of parliaments in other Western democracies, but so far it's only getting there. So far only 6 countries. But then, of course, as you rightly point out, it's not enough to have the law on the books. It needs to be implemented properly. In America, it took almost 5 years for it to begin to be implemented properly. So the law was passed in 2012. When it was passed, by the way, I remember this was November 16th, 2012. This was the anniversary of the death of Sergei Magnitsky in a Moscow prison. And that was the day when the US House of Representatives voted on the bill. And Boris Nemtsov and I were sitting in a gallery in Washington, in the US House of Representatives chamber, watching them vote on this bill. And when it became clear that it passed by a huge margin, Boris turned to me and said, this is the most pro-Russian law ever passed in any foreign country, because it targets the people who abuse the rights of Russian citizens and who steal the money of Russian taxpayers. And I always say this, whenever the Kremlin tries to pretend this is an anti-Russian law, it's not anti-Russian, it's pro-Russian. It's against the crooks and the abusers, but it's for Russia. And so it was passed in 2012. It was only in 2017 when the first high-profile names of human rights abusers were placed on the list. And so for years, the US administration was lukewarm, is actually a very diplomatic term to use. I could use a stronger word. They were basically not implementing. They were sabotaging it. They were putting some low-level people, which I'm not saying shouldn't be. Everybody who's a human rights abuser should be placed. But there certainly should not be any kind of a glass ceiling that if you're important or if you're a friend of Putin, then you are not going to be on that list. They should be. They're the first ones who should be there. And so finally, in 2017, there were 2 important names who were put on the US Magnitsky List. The first by the Obama administration at the beginning of the year, and the second by the Trump administration at the end of the year. So the first, I'll start with the second name. So the second name was Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the Kremlin-appointed leader in Chechnya. And what's happening in Chechnya, even by the general standards of human rights in Russia, which, as you know, not very good, what's happening in Chechnya is just beyond belief, even by the general standards. This is just a black hole. They have daily tortures, killings, disappearances. It's something out of the other world. So they finally, it got them 5 years, but the Americans finally put him on the list. He's still not on the Canadian list, by the way. He's on one of the European lists, I believe in the Baltic, in Lithuania. So he was the second name. The first name was actually somebody who we, many years, were trying to get on the list. In our many meetings, together with Boris Nemtsov, then on my own, in our many meetings with the US senators and congressmen, we were saying that, this person should be on the Magnitsky List. The person's, his name is General Alexander Bastrykin. He's the head of the Russian Investigative Committee, which is the Russian equivalent of the US FBI. I'm not sure what the equivalent agency would be in Canada, the main law enforcement body of the Russian government. So not only was this guy responsible as the top law enforcement official of the Putin government for all the politically motivated prosecutions of recent years, including some of the cases I mentioned, the prosecution of Khodorkovsky and Yukos case, and Navalny, and the Bolotnaya case of the peaceful protesters of 2012, and many others. Not only that, on one occasion, he personally drove a leading independent journalist in Russia, Sergei Sokolov, to a forest near Moscow, took him out of the car, walked him in the forest, and said to him, if your newspaper continues to publish what you're publishing, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to bury you right here in this forest. And by the way, I'm going to be the one investigating, because guess what? I'm the head of the investigation committee. And that is not a dispute. He admitted this. It is not allegedly, or, he also said sorry afterwards. But I don't think that's quite the level of responsibility would want to see. And so, it took the United States government 5 years to get that guy on the Magnitsky List. And so that is a problem, not just here in Canada. You mentioned Vladimir Yakunin. 1 month ago, Vladimir Yakunin received a residence permit in the Federal Republic of Germany and opened an office of his organization in the middle of Berlin. So it's not just Canada. It's across the Western world. He is sanctioned by the US, also placed a few years ago. But he's not yet sanctioned here, as is Kadyrov. So many other people are still not sanctioned. And I think it's important that the law continues to live. It's not enough just to say, it's amazing that you have this law. And you mentioned the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chrystia Freeland. She's a very good friend of mine. And I must say that if it wasn't for her, there would not have been a Magnitsky Act in Canada. She was very enthusiastic and very strong supporter, as she is on human rights issues in general. She's, by the way, the only foreign minister of a G8 country that is banned from going to the Russian Federation by the Putin government. So I think that should say enough. But doesn't depend just on one individual.
Maybe I can interrupt, because earlier in your presentation you asked Canadians to have the courage to live by the principles that we articulate. And I think the Magnitsky Act is a perfect example. We've set something in place, but it requires all of us to be actively engaged in following what is going on, writing letters, telephoning, talking to our elected representatives, to raise expectations that Canada has that same courage to act on the principles that we have articulated.
Absolutely, and it's important to have, John is absolutely right, it's important to have public pressure from below on the governments in Western countries. First, to have those laws in the countries where don't have them yet, but also in the countries where they do have them, like here, to make sure they're implemented properly. So I mentioned Bastrykin. The only reason he was finally sanctioned by the US government is because there was so much public pressure, including from members of Congress, to get him sanctioned, and the administration felt it had no choice. So I think it's important for civil societies in Western countries to create a situation where the governments have no other reason, no other choice, no other way but to go after these crooks and these human rights abusers. And while we're on the subject, I also want to say that, on a more general point, there are different types of sanctions. There are general sanctions against the whole country, and then there are these individual, personal, targeted sanctions against specific crooks and human rights abusers. And I have to say that I can speak for myself here personally. I'm not in favor of the general sanctions because, first of all, I think they don't make much sense. I don't think it's very just to punish an entire country of 140 million people for the actions of a few crooks and criminals around Putin. Go after them. And that is the brilliance of the Magnitsky legislation. It brings this principle of personal accountability, that you don't blame a whole country for the actions of a few criminals. You put a responsibility on them. And secondly, and perhaps as importantly, it's not just more just, it's also more effective. Because going back to the question, Angela, that you asked, of that these people love Russia or don't, no, they don't care about Russia. They don't much care about general sanctions, the people who are around Putin. In fact, they often benefit from them because they can use them for propaganda purposes to try to explain away the problems in Russia that result from their corruption, their mismanagement, their policies. They say, oh, no, it's not us, it's those Western sanctions. When it comes to their personal pockets, their bank accounts, their wives and their mistresses in the West, their homes, their yachts, their palaces, that's when they start caring. So the personal sanctions are both more just and more effective. And just a very quick point that I want to make on the role of the West and of Western civil societies in this case in showing solidarity with those of us in Russia who are standing up for human rights and for democracy and for the rule of law. So I mentioned earlier in my presentation that Russia is a country of symbols. Symbols are very, very important, and I think there's no better illustration of this than the behavior of the Kremlin, the behavior of the current Russian government after Boris Nemtsov was assassinated in 2015. So the astonishing thing is that the Kremlin continues to fight Boris Nemtsov today, more than 3.5 years after he was killed. They're now fighting his memory and his legacy and his name. They're refusing and vetoing and blocking all public initiatives and petitions for any kind of commemoration. Don't forget, he was a distinguished Russian statesman. He was deputy prime minister. He was a 4-term member of the Russian parliament. He was a regional governor. Not allowed to do anything. There are streets in Moscow named after the elder Kadyrov, who had once declared a jihad against Russia and called on his supporters to, quote, kill as many Russians as possible, end of quote. We have a street named after that guy in Moscow. We have a street named after Hugo Chavez, the late dictator of Venezuela. No problems with that. But when it came to an initiative to install a memorial sign on the bridge where Boris Nemtsov was killed, Moscow City Hall responded in the most insulting fashion I could imagine. There's no consensus on this in society, so we're not going to do this. So Kadyrov and Chavez, no problem. So they're vetoing and blocking all the official commemorations, but they do more than this. They're trying to prevent popular memory. And so, although there's no official sign on a bridge, there is an unofficial makeshift memorial where every day, I was just there myself a few days ago on a bridge in Moscow, every day people continue to bring fresh flowers and light candles and put icons and portraits and little notes. It's kind of an unofficial memorial to Boris Nemtsov on that bridge. And several times a month, it's always in the middle of the night, Moscow police and public utility services come in and they steal the flowers and they take away the candles, they pillage everything away, they go and throw it out. Of course, the next morning new flowers and new candles appears, but I think it's a very strong illustration from them. And you should watch the videos. It's absolutely mind-boggling. There are people who, passers-by, who filmed it on their cell phones. You can find it on YouTube and on Facebook. It's absolutely mind-boggling to watch grown men in official uniforms coming to steal flowers under the cover of darkness. So it's being made abundantly clear to us that while this regime is in power, we will not be allowed to commemorate and honor a Russian statesman in Russia. And so, talking about the role of the West, we are deeply grateful to municipal officials and elected political leaders and civil society leaders in Western democracies who have stepped in to do what we for now cannot do at home. And in February of this year, the City Council in Washington, D.C. voted unanimously to designate the block in front of the Russian Embassy in Washington as Boris Nemtsov Plaza in the first official commemoration for Boris Nemtsov anywhere in the world. The unveiling ceremony was held on February 27th, the third anniversary of his assassination. And just 2 months ago, I was in Vilnius, Lithuania, the official unveiling of Boris Nemtsov Square, a small park in front of the Russian Embassy in Vilnius. So this is the first commemoration in Europe. And there is a similar initiative currently underway here in Canada. It was announced 3 months ago by 2 former Canadian Justice Ministers, Irwin Cotler from the Liberal Party and Peter MacKay from the Conservative Party. And they have called on the mayors and city councils in Toronto and Ottawa to do the same, to enact a street or park or square designation, to honor this great Russian statesman that we are not for now allowed to honor in Russia. I hope this initiative succeeds. I hope both of these cities, and maybe many others in Canada, enact these designations. And as I said at the ceremonies both in Washington and in Vilnius, you know, to me as a Russian citizen, there can be nothing more patriotic and nothing more pro-Russian than to name a street or a park in front of the Russian embassy after a Russian statesman. And whatever the people in the Kremlin think of this today, I know there will come a day when Russia as a country will be proud that our embassies and consulates and other diplomatic missions in so many countries are standing on streets and in squares that are named after Boris Nemtsov.
Thank you. So I think on that note, I think we've heard a little bit about personal accountability, some actions that Canadians can take, the role of youth, and I think you've provided some concrete examples of how Canadians can take action. So with that, first I'd like to thank Dr. John Young for his vision with the President Lecture Series and extending the invitation. So thank you very much, John.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, for your generosity. For those in the room, he's going to be here for a few moments. I know there are a number of different questions in the room, so he'll be here to be able to take them a little bit one-on-one. So thank you very much for your time and your generosity here.
Thank you for leading our discussion tonight. Thank you. Thank you for questions.
I just would like to give a few more thank yous. Barbara and Clarence, thank you again for opening us with the blessing, for being here and for participating in the whole session. So thank you very much, as always, for being here and starting this off in a good way. Miigwech. Yeah, we can thank them. Please join me. I'd like to once again extend our thanks to everyone who participated in the live stream, and thanks to the Globe and Mail for their partnership in making it happen. Thank all of you for joining, for contributing your questions, and I'm sure there are many more that will percolate in the days and the weeks to come. You can stay connected with the ongoing human rights stories and dialogue by liking the museum's Facebook page, following us on Twitter, or visiting us online at beta.humanrights.ca. This is just one part in the series. We have a lot of programs that are coming. You can find them on our website. Alors merci, bonsoir, have a safe journey home. Thank you.